now we have those two pins jumpered together, and we want to run this pin over to here, and I want to keep it away from those heaters. Let me just run it straight up like that. Run it up. We have to remember there's three-dimensional space in here, so things don't have to be run in a straight line. You can bend up things like this and go up, across, and over to distance signal wires from like heater wires. It's going to look like that. So we're going to go up, over, and across like that. It's going to work great. So I'm going to have this leaned over just a little bit like this, so I can come in here and flow a bunch of solder onto the pin and onto the wire, and then I'll stand it up when I'm ready for it to cool off and take the iron off. Stand it up, take the iron away, let it cool off, and there we go. So we're going to have multiple things going into the same connection, so we're not going to solder this yet. So let's go ahead and make the wire to come over to here. And I think we want to do the same thing. Let's go up about that same amount. And it'll go over the top of this ground wire like this. And then, how about we just angle it like, well, let me think here a minute. And this is where you just kind of use your creativity on where you want the wires to go. And just try to think about keeping these wires that have the music going through them away from like the AC heater wires, so you don't have to worry about hum getting introduced into the amp. And again, be creative and use all three dimensions that you have available to you for keeping this stuff away from each other. And honestly, almost every amp I build looks a little different, and that's okay. As long as you're meeting the criteria of keeping the stuff away from each other. Just like that. Then I don't know. I think I want to have it more like that. Something like that. Okay. Let's don't overthink this. Let's go ahead and solder this. The other thing is I don't want this getting in the way of the soldering that we have to do later with some of these other components. That cool off. And then that's connected. And again, I don't want to solder this in because I'm going to have capacitors and some other stuff to solder into these. Although, let me think here. I think all I've got is these two capacitors. Because here's the wire from the cathode. It goes over here. One side goes to the resistor. The other side goes to the cap that goes over to ground, and then the resistors both come to ground. So really the only other wire that we're going to have to connect here is I'm going to bring both of these grounds over here as well. And those are from the grid leak resistor. Okay, there's one. So these two guys are going to sit in here like this. Let's go ahead and cut that off. Get it just like that. And again, we want to heat up the terminal first and start at the top. And unfortunately right here is where the camera battery died. Basically it was just showing soldering this one capacitor, and for tolerating my error here, I'm going to throw in a little blooper reel for you to enjoy a little laugh at my expense. Okay, I'm going to try to show you how I'm doing this. Sometimes when you have a big hole like this, and you have just one, God. This is going to be a f***ing pain in the ass. Okay, I'm going to try to show you this little process. Sometimes when you have a hole like this one right here, where you've got a big hole on one of these tag strips and you've only got like one little small wire in here, or maybe two. Like we have this little wire, and then we're going to put this one little capacitor is going to sit in there like that. You got this big hole, and if you have this thing sitting down with this vertically, gravity's going to make all the solder go down and just puddle up down here on the end of that terminal, and it's never going to connect to anything. You're just going to end up with a giant blob of solder down there. And so I've learned that sometimes you have to stand the amp up on its side so that you have gravity working with you. And this was kind of a pain to get set up so I could video it, but I'm going to do my best here to keep my head out of the camera, keep my hands out of the way so you can see what I'm doing here. First, I'm going to come in and fill in the hole with some solder. And try to bridge across it. And see how the solder just keeps trying to pile up on the sides. It doesn't want to go across the gap because the gap's too big. And there we finally got enough solder in there where we've got the hole filled in. Now we got to come in with this capacitor and stick it through that, melt the solder and stick it through the hole and let it cool off. And I was probably blocking your view when I did that little part, but there we go. Now we have the hole is filled up with solder, and the capacitor's soldered into the, the kind of the blob of solder that's going across the hole. We got these two capacitors soldered in place. We got our cathodes connected to the cathode resistor and the bypass capacitor. They're hooked to this, that's the ground for the two cathode resistors, and then this ground's coming over here to our main star ground. So the next thing we need to do is put our two grid stopper resistors in, and this one's real straightforward. It's just going to come across over to this pin. I'm actually thinking about doing something like running this one from here over to this pin, and then running the screen stopper resistor like over the top of it over to this pin. And then both of these pins will be the grids that can be close to the input tubes. And then I just run these screens over here to this pin, and maybe even go underneath these. and just run those straight across like that. That looks even better. And run this one like that. So here are our 1.2K ohm that are our screen stoppers. And we're going to do this side first. Yeah, the screens or the middle pin like that. So let's solder one side of this. And like I told you, I'll show you doing both channels of the output tubes because they aren't identical. But on the input tubes, I'm going to just do this one channel. It's just off camera there. So I just soldered this pin onto here. And then this wire is going to connect right there, and that's going to be our screen connection. So I'm going to cut this off, strip this back. Like that. And then solder this connection. And these smaller terminal strips are easier to deal with when you just have a couple of little small wires going to them. They don't have the lowered hole down here that you can put wires into, but you really don't need them. And honestly, this would have been probably a lot easier to solder if I'd have stuck this wire in this hole with this wire and that wire. There would have been more hole wires in this hole, and it would have ended up being a lot easier to solder. So, guys, if you're doing this again, put all three of these wires in the same hole instead of doing it in that lower hole like I did, and I think it'll make your life a lot easier. So that's the screen on this side. Let's go ahead and do the plate on this side. I think I'm going to maybe go around this and just have it kind of go like that. And come right down there and solder directly under that pin. So this is from the output transformer to the plate. Bend that up, put it to the hole, solder that guy in place. And once I get the solder melted on it, I'm going to pull it slightly out of the hole so we have a good connection with just the wire. Okay, so there's our screen and our plate. So the next thing I want to do is solder the grid leak resistor in. And it's going to go right in here. We want to reserve the lower hole for the grid stopper because you want the grid stopper as close to the tube pin as you can get it. And somehow I've lost my grid stopper resistors. Let me go find them. So now we're going to solder in the grid stopper, and it's the little 1K resistor that goes between the coupling capacitor and the grid of the output tube. You want to solder it into this lower hole and have the body of the resistor as close to the tube pin as you can possibly get it, which we see it's like jammed up underneath that tube socket terminal. So we're going to come in here and solder this guy in place. And that one's done. So I am going to go ahead and solder this other side of this down to this terminal and try to leave the hole open, which I was successfully able to do. And now that little guy's nailed in place too. And here's our other grid stopper. And like I said, I want to make this also be the grid terminal because it's the closest pin to the input tube or the driver tube. So we're going to solder this little guy in this place. We're going to go from here to here with our grid link resistor. Then we're going to go from here to here with our screen stopper resistor. Wow, that's some mouthful of stuff to not get confused saying. So anyway, as you can see, this resistor, this grid stopper, little 1K guy, is shoved up as close to the tube pin as we can get it. I'm going to get this end soldered in place. We are not far from powering up these output tubes and seeing what our B plus voltage turns out to be. We've soldered this on while leaving that hole open to put our coupling capacitor into. And we want to trim this tail off here that was kind of holding that in place while we were soldering it. So the next thing we want to put in is our grid leak resistor. And it's going to go from this hole if I can get it to halfway cooperate, over here to this center terminal, which is going to be our ground. And we can just kind of angle it like that, trim that off. And the other bonus of doing these resistors in this terminal strip this way, we're keeping the grid signal, which is this pin, as far away from this heater as we can. So let's solder that little guy in place. And I'm not going to solder that yet because we got to hook our ground wire to it. And then the last piece of this little puzzle is our 1.2K screen stopper. And it's going to go kind of over the top of both of these. Like that. And it's okay for it to just kind of go flying up in the air like that. So I'm going to try to use what I was doing here earlier. I was using the excess on the other side of the resistor to kind of hold them in the place that I wanted them. Like that. Solder this one in. Clean my tip off a little bit. It was getting kind of grody looking there. Let's go into our screen pin. Screen tap, come over here and connect to that pin. You see some of these amps wired up where they have a Triad and ultralinear switch. I haven't been real impressed with what these amps sound like in Triad mode, and so I just quit even bothering with that. If you want to look at the Blue Glow K88 build videos, they kind of cover doing that. But if you follow to the end of the video, Mark even says it sounds way better in ultralinear mode. And it has more power. So there's our screen tap. Last thing we need to do is get our plate. Run our plate wire over here. And on this channel, how do I want to do this? Let's go around this way. Stay away from those heaters. And go up like that. Then we only have one last thing to do. And we'll be ready to put some power to the amp and get some current running through these output tubes and see what our B plus is going to come out to. And hopefully it's going to be, I know I've built one of these before, but I used a totally different power transformer. And so I'm not sure exactly where the B plus is going to end up using this power transformer. And we may have to adjust it with a different rectifier tube, or possibly a series resistor. But I won't really know until we power this thing up. So all we got left to do is ground these two grid leak resistors over here and then solder this joint up, and we'll have the output tubes all wired up. The only thing that we have to do next then is to wire up the driver tubes and run the coupling capacitor to the grid. Right now, it's going to be, these output tubes are going to be like they have no source. They're going to have the grid leak resistor that's setting the bias. They're just not going to have any signal going to them. So this is how we ended up routing the plate wire from the output transformer to this plate lead. We kind of ran it over this and trying to keep it away from in any way running parallel to the heaters. So both of these are crossing the heaters at 90 degrees. They're away from anything that's going to put home into the system. So all we have left to do is to hook these two ground terminals up over here, and we're ready to power up the amp and see what our B plus comes out to. So I hope you're enjoying this series. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video, and I'll see you soon for more 6SQ7 fun.